been some time since I've sat in front of this camera and done a live stream Bible study, but glad to be back here tonight and looking forward to this next chapter of Nehemiah. So I hope you've not all forgotten the first 9 chapters, and we're moving on to chapter 10 this evening. And looking at this topic of commitment, perhaps I've added the phrase godly commitment, and let's have a look what that looked like in and amongst these people that were in Jerusalem and during the season of the building of the wall. And I think it would be true to say, just as an introduction, that many people often comment, and the comment I've often heard and expressed, perhaps even repeatedly myself: if only people were more committed. And as far back as I can remember, even in my youth committee, youth ministry days, that kind of comment was made. I've heard it made at leadership meetings, and sometimes even, to be honest, I've heard pastors at fraternals speaking about a longing for greater commitment from members of the church, and perhaps even from leaders and pastors themselves. I think it's common thinking that the only requirement for effective ministry is that people would just be more committed. I'm going to go a little bit deeper tonight, because I'm convinced that there's far more to Christian commitment than simply making a decision. Now, of course, we make decisions, but I want to go a little bit deeper and think a little bit tonight about the motivation. There needs to be some kind of internal, I think the word is intrinsic motivation, not just something that is external or natural. And perhaps I could even use the phrase, there needs to be some supernatural engagement, some supernatural intervention and involvement. And so, again, we could go and say, okay, all we need to do is persuade people. We must be able to motivate people through eloquent speech or argument, and then the church will run smoothly, and homes will be happier, and husbands and wives will be more loyal in their godly commitment in the home, or perhaps even in the workplace, and then God will be happy. Well, let's see whether that's the case as we turn to this next chapter in Nehemiah chapter 10. And I want to start in a general sense, and my very first point is I'm going to ask the question: what is it that motivates your commitment to God and His agenda? What's in your mind as you think about this matter of commitment and the need to be committed? Now, people could say, and I want to start in a very general sense, entering into the subject is, well, let's think about commitment, and what is it that we see, what is it that we would like to see, and what is it that influences a given situation, whether it be commitment or lack of commitment. Now, some people will say, well, it has to do with your personality type. With some people, and it is true to say that some people are more driven, some people are task orientated, some people are obsessed about the need to get things done, and on the other hand, there are other personality types that are far more laid back, taking things easy and not particularly driven or pushed in any way. It could be also a sense of obligation. There are some of us, in terms of just our nature and who we are, just feeling, well, I ought to be a responsible person. I need to do what has been given to me. I need to do what is required of me. And there are others who feel less obligated, and it's like water off a duck's back, and it doesn't matter. And then it is true to say that it is possible that some people, some of us, are motivated and perhaps even manipulated by an inspiring kind of eloquent orator, where the motivation moves us into action. Well, let's have a look and see Nehemiah chapter 10. It does look in this chapter, and I do want to encourage you to read the chapter, that here we find these people getting committed. And so much so that we read in chapter 9 verse 38, they make a firm commitment in writing. There's a covenant. They're signing their names. The opening verses of chapter 10, just name after name after name that is listed as they commit themselves to certain things. Well, what is it that we can see looking back over chapter 9, also chapter 10, perhaps there's even a little bit of revision over here. What is it that they came to see in terms of improved spiritual vision? And that's why I say this is not just something external. There's a spiritual element of, and even in our context, as we understand the pouring out of the Spirit and the work of the Spirit after Pentecost, there ought to be a real sense of greater spiritual vision. And so I have a number of points that I want to make, and the first one is improved spiritual vision, to see that God made them and all things. Now we're speaking of the people in Jerusalem, but making application for ourselves as well. God had opened their eyes to see that He is the architect of creation. He's the sovereign creator of the host of heaven. In fact, so much so that the host of heaven worships Him and ought to be the object, and He ought to be the object of their worship. And in fact, you go back to chapter 9 verse 6, you are the Lord, you alone, you have made heaven, the heaven of heavens, with all their host, the earth and all that is in it, the seas and all that is in them. You preserve all of them, the host of heaven worships you. And he goes on, even in fact in verse 7, you are the Lord. So there's no doubt that we also need to be thinking about God, that God is the author of creation. In the beginning, God, and not only in the beginning and then taking His hands off, but His ongoing involvement in creation and over all things. The second is improved spiritual vision to see God's love for them. I thought of the game, and I remember my sisters playing this game, taking a daisy plant and picking the petals. He loves me, He loves me not. He loves me, He loves me not. And if you ever played the game, it depends on the last one standing, as it were, the last petal. Does He love me, or doesn't He love me? And so there's a kind of a feeling when we take this to God, where we wonder, well, does God love me, or does He not love me? And so we don't need to be left in a place where we are simply guessing, does God love? And firstly, let's have a look at these people in Jerusalem. They're not playing guessing games. They begin to see, and again, if you go back to chapter 9 and verse 7, I'll read the passage over there. You are the Lord, the God who chose Abraham and brought him out of Ur the Chaldeans and gave him the name Abraham. And so there's this specific setting of God's love on a people, Abraham, and the promises to him. And so we need to see that. And we find even in the New Testament, Peter reminding the scattered believers due to persecution. And he tells them in chapter 2, verse 7 to 11, unbelievers stumble because they disobey the word. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people of His own possession. Once you were not a people, but now you're God's people. And then he goes on and he urges them to set sin aside in terms of setting aside the passions of the flesh. So these people began to see, but God really loves us. We are His people, and we don't understand the mystery of it. We don't understand why. For certainly we don't deserve it. But certainly we need to see. The scattered, persecuted Christians saw, as Peter wrote to them, and the people in Jerusalem, recipients of grace, recipients and objects of God's redeeming love. Here's a quote that I found, and in fact I don't know who wrote this quote. You know deep within your soul, as one who is a recipient of this love, this redeeming love, that you must swim hard against the current and tide of the sinful nature, lest you be swept along the flow to destruction. It's just that inward sense of knowing, that spiritual vision. God loves me. They certainly saw that. And then, of course, we have the Apostle Paul putting it very plainly. 2 Corinthians 5:14, because we have concluded this, he has died for all, therefore all have died. He died for all, that those who live might no longer live for themselves, but for him who for their sake died and was raised. And so we look at the cross. We see what Jesus did, and there's clear historical demonstration of his love for his people. And then improved spiritual vision to see God's goodness to them. They came to see the providential hand of God throughout their history, the calling of Abraham through the Exodus, out of Egypt, in the wilderness, the wandering in the wilderness, into the promised land. And here they begin to see, they remember and appreciated that their God repeatedly extended his hand of mercy and kindness to them. There's also the other side of it, and again, as they look back, they could see the discipline of God. We know this from Hebrews 13, that this is a demonstration of God's love for his children. In fact, it's Hebrews chapter 12, verse 11. For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. And so these people, looking back, they saw the value of the disciplining hand of God. And then just the last point, certainly they must have been quite aware, had improved spiritual vision of their track record. They must have seen something of how God had kept his hand upon them right through to this very point. And even in the book of Nehemiah, the fact that in enabling them to stand against opposition, enabling them to build the wall in 52 days, enabling them, as we saw from chapter 8, calling for the book and wanting to understand the book, the explanation of the book, and ultimately obedience to the book. And so what I am saying and seeing from chapter 9 and 10 in Nehemiah is that there is a need, if we're talking commitment, godly commitment, there is a need for improved spiritual vision. We need to see beyond just a normal or natural understanding. What is it that motivates it? It's not just managing people externally, but the internal, the love of God constraining, moving us to do that which is pleasing to him. And so here's another quote, my own quote, I guess: commitment is not the cause of effective ministry or godly living, but the result of improved spiritual eyesight, leading to lifestyles of worship. And so we find, as we get to chapter 10 and verse 29, all the rest of the people, that's just in brackets, join with their brothers, their nobles, and enter into a curse and an oath to walk in God's law that was given by Moses, the servant of God, and to observe and do all the commandments of the Lord our God. Now, something unusual had been happening amongst these people. We saw that, and we would even say that there was some kind of revival going on, which I want to get back to when I get to the conclusion of this particular study. But as we move on then, what does this commitment to a lifestyle of worship look like amongst the people of Jerusalem? Surely it is and must be obedience to the will and the way of God. But these people didn't just make generalizations. I want to be committed to God. I will be committed to God. You can expect me to be committed. No, they made very specific, identified commitments where they read the chapter, and we're going to touch on some of them just very briefly, and then perhaps, God willing, in weeks to come, I'll expand on some of them as well. And so to look at what I've called their identified areas of commitment. All of these, and I'm going to get to that in a minute, have relevance for us. They resolved to no longer place the family at risk by intermarrying surrounding pagan nations. Verse 30. Doing this to avoid the dangerous influence, that's the point, This is not prejudice. This is about avoiding the dangerous influence of being led astray to false religion and to the worship of foreign gods. And so a commitment to the family. Secondly, they resolved to halt their commercial activity, their own business, verse 31, on the Sabbath, on the day that was set aside to worship the Lord. They to observe also the 7th year of the land in which the fields would not be worked. You see the obedience to God's commandments coming through amongst them as they make these commitments. Number 3, they resolved not to neglect the temple. Now the temple was the established place of worship. There were certain practices, there was certainly support needed for the priests and those who served in the temple, and God had instituted all of this, and so they make commitments to be loyal in their commitment for the efficient running and effective use of the temple. And again, you can read that in chapter 10, verse 32 to verse 35. They wanted to give a visible demonstration of their common belief and experience, which leads on to number 4. They committed to be better stewards of what God had given them in terms of their crops, being good stewards, submitting to the law, even declaring the firstborn of every household, as well as the firstborn of the flocks belonging to the Lord. Verse 36, there's a generosity. And then they resolved to obey God in bringing their tithes into the storehouse, refusing to hold on to the first fruits of their crops and of labor. Now that's all very well to say, well, that applies to them. They did apply to them. That's what they did. But is there any application for us in our day? And so I want to continue now with what I've called our identified areas of commitment. If we grow in our spiritual vision of God, who He is, and how He relates to us, in some of those areas that I touched on, and particularly His love for us, His care for us, His mercy, His discipline, then surely we too would be asking God, Lord, in what way can I be more committed, more loyal in my worship and in my service to You? Improved spiritual eyesight, perhaps we could even use it to say a greater sense of God and the fear of God and revival, leads to greater godliness and different lifestyles from the world. We need to know when God moves in renewal and revival by opening the eyes and hearts of the people, God glorifying change begins to take place. So like the Jews then, we too ought to be making commitments. We ought to resolve. We ought to make decisions to build a family God's way. It's a very, very simple thing. And God clearly gives instructions and guidelines and counsel with regard to how to build the family, the marriage and parenting God's way, avoiding secular influence. What about setting aside the Lord's Day? Haven't we been influenced by the world where it's just another day to do what we want to do, rather than really setting it aside in our commitment to the Lord for public worship and for rest? What about active and sacrificial interest in the local church? Not just doing that which is convenient or perhaps beneficial because of some kind of receiving that happens, but sacrificial interest in the local church, to be generous in giving to the work of gospel ministry. And thank God for the many, many people who every month loyally and sacrificially, regularly support the church. But I wonder if there are any who need to think about that kind of commitment and say, I too want to be part of what God's doing at Central Baptist Church. Now I want to conclude with an example. And there's great stories of revival when God just moves unexpectedly in different places in amazing ways. And this example is from the 18th century. And some of you would have heard of Jonathan Edwards in the New England area. And the particular revival was known as the Great Awakening. Now let me just give you some of the story. Perpetual war with the Indians produced all manner of inhuman passions. Removing moral convictions and restraints, morals declined and religion decayed. In other words, society was in a mess. I guess one could say that everybody simply did what was right in their own eyes. This author that I got this from describes, he says, drunkenness, swearing, immorality, and every form of vice blossom. Sound familiar? That was the state of the nation in New England, early 18th century. And it wasn't much better in the church. There was a halfway covenant made, it was called in 1662, that opened the way for unconverted people to become members of the church. And then what happens if you have unconverted people entering the church? It's not long, unconverted ministers begin to occupy the pulpits. And then what happens is you have error, shameless sins corrupted and weakened the church. And here's a quote by a certain Reverend Samuel Blair: religion lay as it were dying and ready to expire its last break of life in this part of the visible church. It seemed like it was a hopeless situation. And friends, here's the encouragement. It's into that context, into this situation of hopelessness as we would see it and describe it, God began to ignite fires of revival. Edwards said that it was a degenerate time with dullness of religion. The young people were addicted to night walking, tavern drinking, lewd practices and frolics amongst the sexes. Community leaders were locked in bitter disputes. Then something happened. Two well-known young people died. We're told untimely deaths in the spring of 1734. It had a remarkable, sobering effect on the whole town. People began to ask questions about the meaning of life, questions about life after death, eternity, and other spiritual matters. And then all through this at the same time, a small group of the church was praying for God to move, calling to God for the souls of their neighbors. And I want to encourage those who do pray. Be faithful, keep on, don't give up. Edwards began to preach the gospel deliberately, powerfully, and in December 1734, 6 young people were converted. One was a young woman who was quaintly described as one of the greatest company keepers in the whole town. In other words, she hadn't been a savory lady, but God changed her. Her life was so radically changed that it became the talk of the town. The news of this evident act of God's grace spread like wildfire. In the next 6 months, 300 of the 1,100 population were converted. Revival had come. Let me quote Edwards. There was scarcely a single person in the town, either young or old, that was left unconcerned about the great things of the eternal world. The town seemed to be full of the presence of God. It never was so full of love and full of joy. It was a time for joy in families. Our public assemblies were beautiful. The congregation was alive in God's service, everyone earnestly intent on the public worship. God was served in the beauty of holiness. Isn't that something we ought to pray for? That spiritual vision, not committed for the sake of committed, not committed so that Central Baptist Church is just a smooth running church, but that God would stir deep within our hearts and it would spill over in affecting our community and our church. God being served in the beauty of holiness. And so I'll leave that with you and some discussion questions for those who are together in a group. You can maybe just take a screenshot of that, and may God be with you, bless you, and continue with us over these next days as well.